very much.
Sure.
It seems to me you sort of touched on it, but there has to be a kind of order in which the sort of movement to Harabite happens, and it seems to me that it doesn't start at Harabite at all.
I didn't speak about a movement for Harabite.
No, not movement for Harabite. I mean, you know, the move towards building a mikdash does not start with Harabite. It starts in terms of how, I guess what you said at the end, how Jews sort of where the rabbinic establishment is. And I don't see how it can happen without Sanhedrin. I don't see how it can start without Sanhedrin functioning.
I happen to agree with you entirely. I wasn't suggesting for a moment it could work otherwise. But the only way to create a Sanhedrin is to create it without talking about creating a Sanhedrin. Let me explain what I mean by that. If it doesn't matter, doesn't matter if it's me or somebody else. If a group of Rabbanim get together, as happened some, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 years ago, something like that. I was entirely privy to all the goings on before and during, and if they announce, well, we're establishing a Sanhedrin, what will everybody, including serious people for the most part, what will they say? They'll chuckle. They'll think it's a joke. And almost certainly they'll be right also. Because that's not how it begins, not in my view. And this is why I didn't take part in that, because I tried to explain to the people involved that this is not going to work this way. Their idea was, if you get together 71 people with a beard, and that's how things worked out. In fact, things were so pathetic that when they all got their first kenes together in Tveria, why it had to be in Tveria is another interesting question. It doesn't have to be in Tveria, but they decided it does. They couldn't find 71 people. And I wasn't there, but I was told to me by several people who were present. Their idea was, if you get 71 people on a stage on 71 chairs, and they sort of look rabbinic to some extent, and you say, well, here's a Sanhedrin, now we're in business, now we can begin doing something. Well, that's a joke. That's a very, very sad joke, in fact, because that's not at all how it works. I said to them, a Sanhedrin doesn't begin with 71, it begins with three. It begins with three very serious and unique individuals who understand what needs to be done. They have a vision. They're not daydreamers, not people who hallucinate, people who are serious, but they have a vision. And they will find another two people who are ra'ui, who are fitting and proper, who fit the bill, and they'll join them. There'll be 5, and etc. And there'll be another 2, and you'll have 7 and 9. Eventually, you can get to a Sanhedrin Ktana, which is 23. And in the fullness of time, that can become a real Sanhedrin. That's how it would work. Of course, it would be hugely helpful if the ruling powers of the day supported such an effort. But even if they didn't, because then it would really go much more smoothly and proceed much more quickly. However, even if they're not at all interested in such a thing, if you do it the right way, you will create a certain reality on the ground. And you don't do it, so I said to these people at the time, I said, you don't do it by immediately discussing things to do with Harabite. Don't even talk about Harabite at the beginning. So they'd ask me, so what do you talk about at the beginning? And I told them, I'll tell you what. And maybe you're familiar with this fact, and this is something that some people would say made me famous or infamous, going back 12 years plus now. I said to them, you start talking about kitniot. That's what I said to them, and a lot of them sort of looked at me and said to themselves, this guy's really needs some professional help. What's he talking about, kitniot? How does that help us? And I said, you don't get it. Kitniot is exactly the way to begin. In fact, Benjamin here can testify to the fact that when I first began giving a series of shiurim in Bet Shemesh many years ago, one of the first shiurim I gave was entitled the roadmap from Kitniot to Korban Pesach. That's what it was entitled. Because it's exactly how it works. You begin by breaking the Galut Mode Judaism, the mold of Galut Mode Judaism. I don't know how many of you may have heard this before. I'll get to you, but let me finish. I have to work through this issue. I don't wish to repeat myself if you've all heard it, so if you have, you can just interrupt me in the middle. But I often explain in a sort of graphic and metaphorical way, I explain the issue as follows. If you have a circle of bricks consisting of 10 bricks, or rather, if I give you 10 bricks and I say, well, make a circle out of them, that's simple enough, correct? You'll take the bricks and you'll organize them into a circle, and you'll have a circle of bricks. Fine. If I then come along and say to you, well, here's an 11th brick, add it to the circle, what are you going to do? You either have to remove one of those bricks and insert the 11th brick instead of the 10th brick, which means you'll still have only 10 bricks. You won't have a circle of 11 bricks. Or you'll have to break the entire circle and start again. You have to expand it, which means you have to move everything. Correct? You have to engineer the circle. That's exactly how it works with the Torah. Galut Judaism is a limited circle of bricks, of mitzvot, of ideas, of practices, of minhagim. If you want to move on to a higher level, to a greater, to a more authentic and much more a much broader understanding and version of Jewish existence, you have to break that circle. If you ask why kitniot, I can give you a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a minhag which is based on nothing but mistakes and errors and confusion, which is not what I say. It's what all the Rishonim almost without exception say, Ashkenazi Rishonim included. And even if it were a valid minhag, you have to at some point understand, you have to appreciate the fact that when you have Jews returning to Eretz Yisrael from 100 different countries around the world with different minhagim, if you wish to now reconstitute the Jewish nation, which is what we are supposed to be doing here, surely, if you want to be a Mamlechet Kohanim L'Roi Kadosh, you don't want to just be a collection of tribes and Eidot of Jews who came from different places and continue to maintain and preserve their Galut identity as Moroccan or Hungarian or Russian or Temani Jews indefinitely. If you don't want that, but you want to somehow reconstitute a nation with a national identity and a national purpose and a national vision, which is what the Torah talks about, then you have to understand that you have to tell the Jews, well, now we all have to put halakha remains halakha. There's always room for discussion within halakha. Usually there are different opinions on many things, but minhagim are not halakha. As for minhagim, we have to put them all aside now, and we have to start creating a new Eretz Yisrael minhag for all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't matter if you're Sfaradi or Ashkenazi or something else. And that's exactly what the rabbinical establishment is unwilling to do and unable to do, because they were trained to think in terms of, if your father was Ashkenazi, you're locked into this system of minhagim, and if your father was from Syria or from Teman, you're locked into that system of minhagim, and you can't escape. It's like a prison. You can't get out of that. This is not true. It's true as long as we're talking about reasonable minhagim which are not based on error from their inception, in which case the minhag is not valid to begin with, and that's also halakha. That is halakha. That says in Shulchan Aruch, it says that. But even if a minhag is valid in a certain time and place, if you leave that place, in other words, if you lived in Poland, and in Poland people didn't eat kitniot, rightly or wrongly, let's not go into that now, they didn't, fine. But now you leave Poland, you go to a place where that's not the minhag, that you don't have a reality where all the Jews don't eat kitniot on Pesach. That minhag, and now you choose to live in that new place, you are no longer required to follow that minhag. That also is written in the Shulchan Aruch. It's based on explicit statements in the Talmud, in Masechet Pesachim, Masechet Chulim, etc. So the halachic infrastructure is there. The tools are there. You just have to be willing to use them or to know how to use them. If you have a great big toolbox full of tools, but you don't know how to use them, then you're really no better off than the person who has no tools at all. Most Rabbanim are in that situation. There are the halachic tools of the Torah Shebaal Peh, as Chazal show us and teach us, are there to be used, but you have to know how to use them, and you have to be willing to use them. You have to be willing to take the drill and plug it in and put in the drill bit and actually make a hole in the wall, which, yes, initially involves a bit of noise and it creates some dust on the floor, which you have to sweep up afterwards, etc. But you'll get your hole that you need, correct? If that's what you need to do. If you're not willing to do these things and deal with the small mess in which it involves, if we speak now about Torah and halachic issues, if you're not willing to deal with with all the with all that such a shift in Torah thinking would imply, if you're not willing to deal with that, then you refrain. You don't do anything. You don't drill your hole. You haven't got a hole, so you can't hang up your puzzle on the wall, for example. But you wouldn't have made a hole and you didn't make a mess. Fine, you didn't. You're right. But you didn't do what you needed to do, and you won't be able to do it. You'll be paralyzed out of fear that, what's going to happen if we drill that hole? You need to start with a small number of Chachamim who understand this, who have the Torah background, the halachic understanding, and the courage and initiative and vision to see this and to put it into practice. If this was done in the right way, slowly, over time, certainly wouldn't happen overnight, there would be certain Jews who would take note of this fact, that here are some people who are really on a different wavelength, and they're making sense, and they know what they're saying. You can see, they explain, they write, it's there, it's not as they're not making this up. They're not people who haven't learned sufficiently to express these ideas. Eventually some people would get the message. And the more people join, would identify with that outlook and with that way of doing things, slowly that could grow. That's what I said to these people years way back. They thought I was crazy and didn't understand that no, what you have to do is get 71 people and immediately talk about the Mikdash. Of course, what did that lead? Absolutely to zero. Absolutely nothing. So that whole episode and all the discussions that went on for years before that, again, I'm familiar with what went on. And since that time, all that has simply, like trying to hold sand in your hand between your fingers, just slips away. It dissipated and disintegrated, and there's nothing left of it. But it did have one result, a negative result. It further convinced many other people who from the outset said this won't work and it's nonsense. It convinced them even more that they were right, that such a thing can't work. And that's not true. It can work, and it must work. So I'm not suggesting that we start tomorrow with Har HaBayit, but in order to get there, you have to start on a path that leads there, in a rational, logical way. Yes. I'm sorry, this gentleman at the back.
Thank you once again. The idea, when you were answering the question before about the possibility of the Sanhedrin. Well, first of all, if we can't even get even a coalition or any political party together, we can't even agree on seemingly anything from the political to the religious. But even so, wouldn't it be difficult, based on the original idea of the Sanhedrin, which came from Yitro, of course?
Which came from where?
Yitro.
Well, in a manner of speaking.
That was kind of like the first one, right?
Sort of, maybe.
Yeah, well, the credentials for it are quite demanding for obvious reasons. And, I just wanted to ask, do you think there's enough people here that have those kinds of,
no, I can answer that question in the affirmative. Yes, there are such people, and I know some such people. A number of them, certainly. Let me remind you that 500 odd years ago, in Tzfat, the Mari Berav, the Rav of the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, wished to, and in fact did, reinstitute a Sanhedrin, or the Smicha, the concept of Smicha, which is necessary as part of that process. He introduced that, or reintroduced that concept, based on what the Rambam writes, how it should be done. He did that. And this was accepted by almost every single Chacham at that time in Eretz Yisrael, except for a handful here in Yerushalayim, not here, I'm saying here, in Yerushalayim. I lived in Yerushalayim for many years, so force of habit. So there were a couple of Chachamim in Yerushalayim who didn't accept this idea, but at that time 98% of the Chachamim in the country lived in Tzfat, and they all accepted the idea. And they did reintroduce the Smicha. Why did it not continue? For historical reasons, for the same reason that the Yishuv of Jews in Tzfat fell apart, which it did. It was a small, relatively short brief historical period where there were thousands of Jews living in Tzfat at that time, and there were many Chachamim also, and it was possible to do something, and something was done. When that reality began to unravel, as it did for historical reasons, when the whole institution also unraveled. At any rate, what was the requirement of the Mari Berav and his followers when we're giving someone smicha at that time? Not to know Kol HaTorah Kula by heart, which is really a tall order. There are a few people perhaps like that as today as well, but that's a very tall order. The requirement was defined as knowing Hilchot Harif U'Mefarshav, which is a much less tall an order. It's something very serious. But to know all the Rif and the Mefaresh around the Rif, to know the basic Shitot, so to know more or less what the discussion's about, and to have an idea of the basic Shitot, the basic halachic approaches to the major practical questions of that time, which is the Rif, talking about what's called Hazman Hazeh, that which is relevant in Galuth, not talking about the Mikdash, by the way. But that was the requirement. It wasn't someone who knows Bavli and Yerushalmi and Tosefta by heart. That wasn't the requirement, and that's something that exists. Yes, it does. I'm not saying every Rav is like that today, but it exists. At any rate, the point is, you have to start with a small number of very serious people who have even a very few real supporters who understand that this thing is for real, it's serious. It may begin now, and it may only reach fruition in 2 or 3 generations from now. That's also possible. After all, when Herzl came up with his idea of Zionism, first of all, how many Jews thought at the time that this was a good idea? Handfuls of Jews. Most Jews thought this guy was totally off his rocker. They thought this guy was totally unrealistic, a daydreamer. Nothing would come of this thing. That's number one. Number two, how long did it take from the first Zionist Congress to the establishment of the State of Israel? About 60 years. That's 2 generations plus. All right? You have to think in those terms, at least 2 generations plus. You have to be willing to understand that we're talking about an immense undertaking on the one hand, but not something which is beyond us. It's not crazy, and it has to happen. As the Rebbe Mikotsk once said to his Talmidim, when someone asked him a certain question, he said, "Don't ask me if something is possible. Ask me if it's necessary. If it's necessary, then it has to happen. And it's up to us to figure out how to make it happen." Now, Herzl had an idea, he came up with something, he kicked the ball into play, and things developed. No one could even foresee at that time, at the end of the 19th century, how things would play out several decades later. But they did. And here we are. So you never know exactly how things will play out. You don't have to know. You have to know that this thing is necessary, it's right, it makes sense, and it's our responsibility. And if you accept those facts of life and that responsibility, then you can immediately begin to get to work, and you don't have to hold out for immediate recognition or success overnight. That's not the way things work. Yeah.
What's the opinion on the Shita that the Mikdash is in the south of Har Bayit, and also on the rabbis who say that because there are so many different Shitot, we have a Safek D'Oraita. Not only is it a Safek D'Oraita, but it's one that's Efshar L'Bareh, so in time we could find out, so it doesn't even count as we don't even have any of the kulot that might come with Sfikot, and therefore that Klalei Halakha tell us that we should go to Qumrah on this.
Well, I already said before, I don't believe anyone who tells me he knows for a fact where the Mikdash stood precisely, and I don't think we'll know until we excavate. I'm also convinced that if we do excavate, we'll discover what we need to know in short order, and then we'll be able to. The whole discussion will be based on more factual information. Having said that, the vast majority of serious people who have looked at this issue as opposed to Rabbanim who have never looked at the issue but are convinced that it's asur, therefore why discuss it? The vast majority of serious people who looked into it hold by the shita that the Mikdash was on the present raised platform where the golden dome stands today. And as I said, the Hatam Sofer thought so, and the Chazon Ish thought so, and the list is very long. Okay? And I think, if you appreciate the fact that we're not at liberty to do nothing. Doing nothing comes with a heavy price, just as doing the wrong thing comes with a heavy price. So we have to be willing to do that which can be done within the framework of the halakha. So if we know for a fact that certain areas are definitely mutar, there's no reason not to go there. In fact, there are very good reasons to go there. It's also part of this breaking of the mold, to get people to think outside the box, to begin to see Har HaBayit as something that is relevant and shayach to us. It belongs to us, and we're supposed to be in charge of that area. And there are certain things that Torah commands us to do in that place called Har HaBayit. If we simply turn it into something which is off limits, something extraterritorial, as it were, doesn't belong in this world, as it were, it's something it's a piece of heaven on earth that we can't enter. Well, then how are we ever going to break the mold? No question, the right thing to do would be to start excavating tomorrow morning. That would be the right thing. That would be the very best thing to do. But as long as that's not about to happen, we have to increase awareness of the Mikdash. And this is one way to do so. Last question, yes?
In order for someone to become part of the 3 founding members of the eventual Sanhedrin, do they need to be considered prominent in the eyes of a significant majority or a near unanimous majority of Torah observant Jews?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer, of course, is yes and no. And it can't be otherwise, because the Jewish world today is so divided and confused that even amongst the Haredim, there's no agreement. If you take the Haredim for a moment, there's no agreement who the biggest names are. Because if you ask a Litai Avrech from Bnei Barak, or for that matter from Yerushalayim, he'll say, well, Rabbi A and Rabbi B. But if you ask one of the breakaway faction in Yerushalayim, they'll say Rabbi C. Correct? If you start talking to Hasidim, you'll start hearing other names and other ideas mentioned. Correct? You know what's going to happen if you talk to a Chabadnik, and that's just that part. That's that section of the Jewish world, and then you start dealing with other parts of the Jewish world. What possible consensus can exist in such a situation? The answer is there cannot be, and there will not be. To imagine that we have to wait for such a consensus is I think a mistake. That would be analogous to Herzl saying, well, I have an idea and I think it's a good idea, but I'm not going to do anything about it until at least 50% of the Jews in the world agree with me that it's a good idea. Well, if that had happened, if that had been the case, then we wouldn't be here and nothing would have taken place. Okay? Yeah.
Okay. So it's not viable, but it is necessary.
No, I don't think that's necessary, because I think, in other words, it would be desirable, certainly. If there was such a consensus in the Torah world, all the different factions and stripes and colors within the Torah world, if that were to be possible, that would be wonderful. But it's not. But it's more than that. You have to understand, it's not possible because these different factions are not even speaking the same language, really. They each have their own, as it were, language, their language of Torah. Just like Chabad have their language and their terminologies and their concepts. The same is true for Lita'im, the same is true for Hasidei Vizhnitz, the same is true for, within the Dati Lumi world, you have people from Mekaz Harav, Haramor, another yeshiva, this one, that one. there's no end to the different mindsets that exist, and they don't really understand each other, because they're all working with a different set of assumptions. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason for that is confusion, or a lack of understanding of what we're facing. It's like taking a number of people off the street who have never studied civic engineering, and telling them there's a problem with this bridge. Every time we build it, it collapses. Would you like to look at it and tell us what we're doing wrong? Well, each one of these people who doesn't understand how to build a bridge will come up with a different response, perhaps, but none of them will have the right answer. The only person who has the right answer, he may be in a minority, and maybe no one's asked him yet, but it's the only person who knows is the person whose business it is, who studied how to build such a bridge, correct? So there's a reason that most of the Jewish world is, everyone's talking at cross purposes and not really hearing what the other person is even saying. There's a reason for this, because they're all coming from a very limited, narrow perspective and version of Judaism. They don't see the big picture, they haven't got the overview, and they haven't got the vision. And they're each of them are working within a certain mold in which they grew up, or into which they were taught to accept, whatever. And therefore, to expect that these different factions and groups, each really living in their own virtual reality almost, will be able to communicate with each other, it's not a realistic expectation. Therefore, you need to find people who understand this, who therefore come to the problem with a different set and the correct set of assumptions, and have the skill set to deal with this issue, whether they fit into one of those boxes or not. Now, if such a group of people begin to work together and begin to publish and make certain statements, and thus attract, slowly but surely, followers, people who understand and accept this way of looking at things and living as Torah Jews, that begins to make waves in the world, in the Jewish world. People will begin to hear there's this new force, there's this new reality out there in the Jewish world, and it's very different from everything else we've heard before. But let's check it out. Let's find out what it's about. That's how I think it will work. That's how I think it has to work.
And instead of 12 factions, you've got 13.
Why? Why 13?
Just arbitrary. No.
Oh, okay. Well, it could be. I think 13 is fantastic. I think we have about 100. If 13 is only 13, maybe we can make a deal somehow. 100 is we have so many variations on the theme, but they're all on the same theme. Galut no Judaism. Many variations, but it's all the same theme. And we need a different theme altogether, a different paradigm. You had a question?
Yeah.
Go on.
One was just a short question, then I have a general question. One, we said that too much Puya of the Tzibur.
Yes.
Why do we not make this argument when it comes to going on to Har HaBayit today? Everyone's telling me.
Because, okay. Well, first of all, there are some people who make this, who make such a claim. Their claim is, I don't accept this claim, but there are those who claim that what we're doing today, going up to Har HaBayit, is actually a kind of kibush. We're engaged in an act of kibush of Har HaBayit, which is it's a part of Eretz Yisrael which has been left unconquered, as it were, which is entirely true, by the way. I accept that. It's not really conquered. It's not really under our control. Those who claim that it is, I think, are simply fooling themselves. And the situation today is worse than it was 30 years ago. There are those who claim, therefore, this is an act of kibush, and as such, we are allowed to go to Har HaBayit whether we're tameh or tahor. It makes no difference, because this is an essential part of the mitzvah of building the Mikdash and kibush Eretz Yisrael, and this is the part of Eretz Yisrael, and it's more than that. And if that's what it takes to get the Jews back to Har HaBayit, then that's what we need to do. The problem with that, in my view, is that Jews have been going on to Har HaBayit essentially, more or less, at the beginning in small numbers and slowly over time in increasing numbers. Jews have been entering Har HaBayit, religious Jews, people who went to the mikveh and what have you, since shortly after Milchemet Sheshet HaYamim. In actual fact, I knew one of the original people who went on to Har HaBayit at that time. And yet we see that this has been going on for 5 or 4 decades certainly, and it hasn't really changed the situation. In other words, to say that I'm doing something now as an act of kibush, and maybe in 70 years down the road it will result in a change, maybe and maybe not, that doesn't strike me as something you can define as kibush. An act of kibush has to be something which, the likelihood at least, there's a definite probability that this will lead within a certain foreseeable span of time to a result, the result that you want. Right now, it's a tactic. It's an important. The idea is good, and it does raise awareness, and I'm for that. But to claim it's an act of kibush, unfortunately, that's not true. For that to happen, you need a change of government or a change of regime. In actual fact. And that will only happen when more Jews accept that other way of looking at Torah that we've been discussing. When more Jews think in those terms and reject the Rabbanut Rashit set up by David Ben Gurion, precisely for the purpose of putting these datim into a nice little official ghetto. We'll keep them there, we'll pay them some salaries, we'll get them out of our hair, we'll keep them happy, and we'll get on with the business of doing what we want to do. That was exactly the purpose of creating the Rabbanut Rashit as it exists today. It's not exactly the same as the Rabbanut Rashit in the days of Rav Kook. It was different, because there wasn't a Medinat Yisrael way back then, and things were very different for many reasons. It wasn't so wonderful then either, perhaps, but it's not what it is today. Today it's an embarrassment, frankly. And it certainly doesn't achieve anything very, very of any note, of any significance. What it does do, again, it's like going about trying to establish a Sanhedrin the wrong way. If you do it the wrong way, you're going to end up convincing more people that such a thing is hopeless, and therefore why bother even talking about it. In the same way, if you set up a body like that, which is so remiss in doing what a true Torah establishment should do, then you simply convince more people that the Torah has nothing to say, nothing of value to say. That's Torah. Well, we don't want it. Thank you very much. So it's actually it's more harmful. It brings more harm than good. So again, if we believe in the Torah, if we believe in ourselves, if we believe that when we do the right thing, eventually Hashem will bring about a situation which will allow, the circumstances will allow us to move things forward and to succeed. If we believe in that, which we must believe, because that's how Jewish history has always worked, then we are able and must go about this business of creating that alternative. As a final idea, Jewish history, in my view, should be viewed as a kind of wave like a sine wave on a screen, right, up and down. Hashem brings about certain historical realities and circumstances that change over time. Sometimes we're at the top of a wave, and sometimes we're going down with the trough, and then we go up again. In order to succeed, you have to be prepared. You have to way ahead of time. You have to build the infrastructure, the ideas, the organization, the education involved, so that you have that critical mass of people and of chachamim and people with that vision and that yearning for these ideas, so that when you find yourself on the rise, when the wave is in your favor and it's going up, and you can ride that wave, then you'll be able to implement what you've been thinking about and planning for so long. But when the opportunity arrives, and you're totally flat-footed, you don't hit the ground running, you're on your back, lying on your back, and the situation is there, and you haven't even thought about it, what's going to happen? Nothing. That's exactly what happened to us in Sheshet Yamim. We found ourselves in control of large areas, not all of, but large areas of Eretz Yisrael, including the most important part of Eretz Yisrael, Har HaBayit, Yerushalayim. And not only was the state of Israel, the secular establishment, unprepared and disinterested, even the religious world was unprepared and disinterested. In other words, the failure there was what happened in all the years prior to that war, that we hadn't educated people for what we'll do when the time comes. You can't always precipitate that reality that will be necessary, that situation which will be required so that you can do certain things. But eventually that will come about. But you have to be prepared. So let us prepare now for the wave of the future. Kol Tov.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.